Hello, how are you?
Yes, it is my real name.
What?
Film with that.
What inspired you?
My whole thing has always been a DIY thing. It's not really so much a choice. I've never had any money, to be able to do anything. So, and that's what the underground is. The underground has always kind of been a cinema of poverty, so you just use whatever you can, And one of the things that you can use is other people's films. That unsurrealism is kind of weird because it wasn't do-it-yourself, I guess, because it was quite an expensive thing to do, to make films in the 1920s. But I mean, my thing has always been about the democratization of filmmaking. So it's always been about how do you get rid of the separation between the audience and the filmmakers, and how do you create a culture in which anyone can be a filmmaker, in which anyone can make a film. And when we started doing what we do, it was actually very difficult because equipment was expensive, and even if you managed to get the money to make a film and you made the film, it was very difficult to get it shown anywhere, to get it into a cinema or even, to show it anywhere. So we were always about trying to get maximum access so that everybody could make a film. Everybody and anybody could make a film. And part of the DIY thing that we were doing was when we put on our film shows, it became obvious that anyone could also put on a film show. So so it became totally accessible. And also because our film shows are open access, so we don't select or curate anything. So if you want to be in one of our shows, all you do is you just send the film, and then we'll show the film. And this was all part of the strategy, was to totally sort of get maximum democracy, so that also to break down the idea of expertise, because we were kind of still are. It's against expertise and it's against professionalism. So we're basically saying you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be a professional. Anybody can do this. And by doing that, we're trying to sort of, the radical edge of that is to break down the whole idea of art being some kind of mystical, sacred power that is in the hands of a small elite, and to just break it open so that you get the liberation of art. Well, fuck art, it doesn't matter. It's more to do with like the liberation of filmmaking, where the object becomes the abject, overdetermined, indifferent, a slow zoom to an aleatory landscape, which lies beyond and beneath the syntactical socializing power of hegemony, in a system of tedium, where pain and desire implode into textual bliss. Duration opens up the space between the dog, the pollen, the chair, the artist, the camera, the phallus, the text, the spectator. David Bowie used to show Chien Andalou before he came on stage, so that would be the first experimental film I saw, would have been of that. So it was always in the culture, and the whole punk thing was into William Burroughs, and from Burroughs you find out that he made films, and so it was a natural transition from sort of the punk culture into the underground, and the underground into the experimental film.
Cap up by £8,000, they sweat on their way down. Great pots with customs masters hang around like clowns. They are containers and their drivers.
Burroughs, Jack Smith, Marky Smith of The Fall in the way he speaks and delivers, and his poetry. Godard and the whole new wave, French new wave, and but also popular culture as well. It's not just, I've always been very inspired by, trash pop stuff. I remember seeing Godzilla films when I was very young, which were fantastic. But it was I think it was watching TV and staying up and watching old movies on TV and discovering, strange and obscure films. I guess in the sort of 70s and 80s, it was much easier to come across obscure sort of, experimental film on TV just by accident. The key difference with growing up with TV as the main influence and cinema as the main influence, TV is much more fragmented, and it can be more fragmented because you can change. Well, for one thing, you can be watching, a black and white Godard film, and then suddenly there's a colour advert for a car in the middle of it, or some cereal or soap, and then you're back in the Godard film, and you have to sort of, and the convention is that you're able to sort of, in some way, disengage one meaning from the other. You're able to sort of pause but of course you're not, you're kind of, really, especially if you're a kid, you're kind of, it's all go. And then changing channels as well, you change channel from some wildlife film onto a gangster film, and then, so it's a lot more fragmented, and a lot more sort of playful, because you can make your own sort of you can make your own mashups just by changing channel, or you could. So, and also because with TV, sometimes you would turn on, as a kid, you'd turn something on, you wouldn't have seen the beginning of it. And you'd be like, what? It would be absolutely kind of fascinating, but you wouldn't know what it was, or why it was, or, So it's that whole fragmentation that is really interesting to me. I like everything. It's all good. But lately I've been doing a lot of that stuff as well, a lot of what then it's called mashup now, but it has different names, I tell you, the big influence on me was another London filmmaker called George Barber, who still makes films now, and he made some fantastic films in the 80s, and in those days it was called scratch filmmaking. It was the origins of scratching. So it was taking the aesthetic and the methods from hip hop, but using them visually. So you would, you scratching the record, but scratching the videotape. Yeah, well, I totally agree. I mean, I was just reading something the other day, actually, by, it was Debord, and he was saying about how, basically he goes beyond Godard. He says, not only can you do it, but you should do it, You should plagiarize, and you should use other people's stuff, and that's the way forward. And I think that's true. But it can be a problem, obviously, because of copyright and stuff like that. I mean, they've changed the law here recently, so. But it's never been a problem for me, really, because I've never really been in a situation in which I've been so successful that anyone's cared. I did this performance which was a live mixing of Silence of the Lambs with Wizard of Oz. And that worked pretty well, actually, because they're kind of basically the same film. But one's like a horror film, one's a children's film, but they're pretty much the same thing. What I did was I got two projectors, projecting from like one angle onto the screen, and which meant I could stand in the middle and then I could block bits off like this. And I had these shapes made out of cardboard, so I could hold them up, and then that would create a circle, and then in the circle would be one film, and then around it would be the other film and stuff like that. It's quite neat, yeah. worked quite well. But there was only about 5 people there. So, yeah. There's a bit of that online somewhere. I can't remember where it is, but there's a bit of it around. The mainstream cinema is just sitting in rows in the dark, watching a screen, and it's kind of like, it's not a social experience, it's an anti-social experience. So the difference is, we started, with our film shows, it's a very convivial atmosphere. Everybody's eating and talking and drinking and hanging out, and if they don't like the films, they talk in the middle of the films, or they heckle the films, so it's a completely different sort of cinema. What really interested me was, when we first started doing our shows, we came out of a big squat, which was in an old suntan oil factory, and we were originally doing our shows down in the sort of right in the basement of the factory, and it was really cold. And then we moved up into the canteen, and so then we said, all right, we're in the canteen, so we might as well have food. So we had a kitchen, we had like a bar with a kitchen, and we made food, and we're showing the films, and we're serving food to people. And this is all going on during the screening. People are queuing up, getting food, they're going down, they're sitting, they're watching the films, they're eating their food, and everyone's drinking beer and getting pissed as well. And at the same time, we're projecting films all over the ceilings and the wall and stuff like this, and everything's going wrong. And this kind of like changed everything that we did, Suddenly, it was a completely different thing. And it wasn't to do necessarily with having an idea, or following an aesthetic. It was to do with the fact that we changed the nature of the social nature of the event. Once you start having sort of, especially with food, strangely enough, you have people eating during the film, it completely changes the way the films work. And also with short film as well, it's different. Because we were going to back in the sort of 90s, early 90s, whatever, if you went to artists, so-called artists or experimental film shows, basically it was usually in a gallery or a small cinema, and everybody just sat down, and a lot of these films were silent. There was no soundtrack, because that was the thing at the time. It was kind of minimalist. So everybody sat there in absolute, complete dead silence, and nobody in the dark, and watched these films. It was just like a sort of church reverence thing, and it was just miserable, it was really, and if you didn't like the films, you were just trapped, in this space. You couldn't leave, really. And you couldn't do anything else. You're all in rows watching the films. Whereas what we discovered was, we could show 20 films, and if people didn't like them, they just didn't watch them. And then they'd watch the ones they did like, and the ones they didn't like, they wouldn't watch. And so you get a kind of much more convivial sort of punk atmosphere to the screening. And then that makes you make different films as well. Once you start doing that, the way you make films changes, and the way the whole aesthetic changes. And it's a different thing as well. It's like in underground cinema. In underground cinema, you got to understand that a lot of those films that were made by people who were either on drugs or were watching those films when they were on drugs, or they were made to be watched by people who were on drugs, and that's the kind of experimentalism, and then when you get into the avant-garde, the sort of the artist film video, it's got nothing to do with that whatsoever, it's just, it's the dead hand of sort of, abstraction or whatever, so. Because really, I guess the psychedelic thing and the punk thing go kind of hand in hand. They're basically both doing the same thing, which is about sort of, it's kind of like a shock. Somebody was saying, is the exploding cinema, you know, still as relevant as it was because of the YouTube and the whole digital explosion, the fact that anyone can get their hands on equipment and anyone can distribute and exhibit their film, and it's, you know, etc. And then I was kind of thinking about when we first started doing it, when I first started doing it, and really the actual sort of ideological political situation hasn't really changed. It's kind of interesting. I mean, you still got experimental film dominated by this very, you know, very small elite, and it's very institutionalized. And my dream has always been that, going back to the punk thing, the thing about the punk thing is that it's the radicalism of punk is completely, can only really be equated with the fact that it was very popular. You know, if it had happened and nobody knew about it, you know, it wouldn't have been radical. It's the effect of its radicalism was that it turned on all these kids all over, you know, Europe and America, and spawned all these projects simply because it penetrated so far into youth culture and subculture and stuff like that. And so my dream has always been that, you know, experimental film could be like that. It could be that every single, you know, small town had its own little experimental underground cinema, and kids could just put films on, stuff like that. But it's kind of going that way, you know. I mean, the micro cinema movement, pop-up cinema thing that's going on in London at the moment is incredible. You know, there's never been so much stuff going on and interesting new projects. Like I'm getting involved with this there's a cinema down in Deptford. You know Deptford? Yeah. Called Deptford Cinema. And that's completely volunteer. So all you got to do is you go along onto a Sunday meeting, and then from that moment on, you can do whatever you like there. And if you want to put on a film show or show a particular film, you can join the programming group, and then you just go online and you pick a day, and you can do whatever you want. You know, it's quite unbelievable. People don't believe it. They go along and they're kind of looking for somebody to give them permission, you know, or give them authority, or find out who the leader is, you know what I mean? But really, it's really, really amazing sort of anarchic, democratic organisation. So there's loads of really interesting stuff still going on, you know. What's that noise? It's my daughter watching Japanese cartoons.